Okay, this is an idea that I think is really interesting, and I'm learning about it, and I'm exploring it. I'm trying to understand how it fits into business, and it's based on game theory. So, in game theory, there are two kinds of games. There are finite games, and there are infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed-upon objective. Baseball. We know who the players are, we know what the rules are, and we all agree that whoever has more runs at the end of 9 innings is the winner and the game concludes. It's perfectly fine, right? Then there are infinite games. An infinite game is defined as known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, and the objective is to stay in the game. When you pit a finite player with a finite player, the system is stable. Baseball is stable. When you pit an infinite player versus an infinite player, the system is also stable. The Cold War was stable because everybody knew that there was no such thing as a winner or loser, and we had to keep the game in play for it to maintain its stability. Because there are no winners and losers in an infinite contest, the only way that things change is when one of the players drops out because they no longer have the resources or the will to continue to play, right? The problem arises, however, when you pit a finite player versus an infinite player, because a finite player is playing to win, and an infinite player is playing to keep the game in play. This is bad for the finite player. This is what happened to the United States in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were fighting for their lives. America was trying to beat the North Vietnamese. This was what happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was trying to win. The Mujahideen would fight for as long as is necessary. If you listen to most businesses, the vast majority of businesses do not understand the game they're playing. The game of business inherently is an infinite game. The game of business has existed long before every single company on this planet exists, that exists right now, and it will continue to exist long after every single company on the planet is dead and gone, right? In other words, the game of business is infinite. But if you listen to the language of businesses, they don't understand the game they're in. They keep talking about being number one. But in the finite game, we agree on what the objectives are and we agree on what the rules are. So when a company announces we're number one or we're striving to be number one, based on what? Revenues, market share, profit, square footage, number of employees. And by the way, what other companies have agreed that that is the standard of being number one? Oh, and by the way, what other companies have agreed on the time frame that we all agree, you're right, you won, we lost. In other words, it's arbitrary. Organizations, individuals, salespeople make up their own standards that no one else has agreed to. Yet again, a sign that we're in an infinite contest, because in a finite contest, we agree on the rules. Plus, it's about the competitors. In a finite contest, we know who all the competitors are. It's a fixed set. In an infinite contest, we know some of the competitors, but not all of the competitors. You do not know who all of your competition is. We study the competitors we know about. We do competitive analyses on the competitors we know about. But 99 times out of 100, it's the ones we don't know about that show up and steal our lunch. Do you think that MySpace had any sense that Facebook even existed? They were doing plenty of competitive analyses, doing all kinds of presentations and PowerPoints, and then this unknown competitor showed up. The rules are infinite. The rules are infinite. Let me give you a real-life business example of of what a finite player and an infinite player look like. I spoke at a education summit that's funny, at an education summit. You get it? Because I used education, it's a vowel. It's about education, never mind. I spoke at an education summit for Microsoft. I also spoke at an education summit for Apple. At the education summit for Microsoft, I would guess that about 70% of the executives spent 70% of their time presenting talking about how to beat Apple. At the Apple Summit, 100% of the executives spent 100% of their time talking about how to help teachers teach and how to help students learn. One of them was obsessed with their competition. The other one was obsessed with where they're going. One was playing a finite game. The other one was playing an infinite game. Now, at the end of my talk at Microsoft, they gave me a gift. They gave me the new Zune when it was a thing. And I got to tell you, this thing was gorgeous. This thing was spectacular. It was the most elegant piece of technology I'd ever seen. The user interface was incredible. It was flawless. It worked perfectly. It was unbelievable. It was way better than my iPod Touch. The problem is it didn't work on iTunes, so I couldn't use it. It's a different story. So I'm sitting in the back of a taxi at the end of the Apple conference with a very senior Apple executive, sort of like employee number 12 kind of guy. And I decide to stir the pot. And I turn to him and I say, you know, Microsoft gave me their new Zune, and it is so much better than your iPod Touch. And he turns to me and he says, I have no doubt. Conversation over. Because the infinite player understands that sometimes you're a little bit ahead and sometimes you're behind. The infinite player understands that sometimes you have the better product and sometimes you don't. Because it's not about winning every single battle. It's about staying in the game longer than the other guy. Remember, every single company that goes bankrupt didn't lose or fail or anything like that. They ran out of the will or the resources to continue to stay in the game. Almost every single merger and acquisition that ever happens is an announcement that one or both of the companies can no longer stay in the game with the will or the resources they have, and so they have no option but to combine their entities so that they can try and stay in the game a little longer. If you look at all the great companies, the companies that, the precious few companies that folks like me and Seth and Gary write about and talk about, the Apples, the Harley-Davidsons, the Southwest Airlines, the Costcos, what you find is that none of them are obsessed with their competition. Every one of them is obsessed with the direction and the path that they are on. In other words, they are all playing the infinite game. And every single one of them frustrates the heck out of their competition. That's one of the reasons that they are the exception to the group, even though they may sell similar products, or even though they may be at a parity price, sometimes not. The difference is that they stand for something, that they know what they stand for and they know where they're going, and that is their obsession. And it's okay to be a little bit behind in the short term because no one has agreed what the time frames are anyway, and the goal is to last longer than the other guy.